Good evening and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Marisa LaFleur, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with TYLER STOVALL presenting his book, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea. I hope you are all safe and hanging in there. Thank you for joining us virtually. Through virtual events like this one, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community during these challenging times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, you can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events. And you can also go there to sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves right from your home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speaker at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button right at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting links to purchase tonight's featured book at harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last few months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. TYLER STOVALL is a renowned historian, currently serving as Dean of Fordham University's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Previously, he was Dean of the Humanities Division and a Distinguished Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. From 2016 to 2017, he also served as President of the American Historical Society. He is the author of 10 books, including Transnational France, The Modern History of a Universal Nation, Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, and The Rise of the Paris Red Belt. He specializes in transnational history, labor, colonialism, and race. His latest book, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, traces the complex relationship between freedom and race from the 18th century to today in France and the United States, the two leading nations that have claimed liberty as the heart of their national identities. Historian Thomas C. Holt calls it an impressive work of scholarship on an issue of enduring moral and political relevance. And historian Christopher L. Miller writes that, ranging widely across history and geography, Stovall takes the white goddess of liberty down from her pedestal with force, erudition, and elegance. We're so pleased to have him here with us virtually tonight. Without further ado, the digital podium is yours, TYLER.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you all for attending tonight. I really appreciate your taking the time to come out and hear a bit about my work. It's great to be back at Harvard Bookstore, even if virtually. I can remember being there as an undergraduate and enjoyed it tremendously, and I'm glad to see it's still here after these years. So I wanted to just speak a bit about my book, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, talk about the reasons why I came to write this book, talk about some of its major themes, and above all, I'm very interested in hearing your questions and your comments about this topic. Let me start off by reading a bit from the book, and I want to read the introduction, partly because, of course, it is the introduction, but also because it deals with something that's been in the news recently, the US Capitol building. So, at the start of the 21st century, the American Congress appointed a task force to investigate the veracity of a persistent rumor that the US Capitol building, among many other official structures in Washington, D.C., had been built by the labor of Black slaves. Rumors to this effect had existed for some time, but recent revelations of receipts for payments for slaves found in the Treasury Department had lent them new credence. Accordingly, Congress created the Slave Labor Task Force in order to investigate the rumors and decide what, if anything, the federal government should do in response to them. In 2005, the task force released its report entitled History of Slave Laborers in the Construction of the United States Capitol, concluding that the rumors were true. And I'm just going to quote a bit from the report. It says, soon after it was finished in the 1820s, the Capitol began to be called the Temple of Liberty because it was dedicated to the cherished ideas of freedom, equality, and self-determination. How then can a building steeped in those noble principles have been constructed with the help of slave labor? The first step in the capital's evolution was taken in the last decade of the 18th century and was, in fact, assisted by the toil of bondsmen, mainly slaves rented from local owners to help build the capital and the city of Washington. The report's conclusions led Congress to take several actions to rectify the historical record and acknowledge the role played by African slaves in the building of the Capitol. Unlike most congressional activities at the time, they represented a bipartisan effort, reaffirming the accord of both Democrats and Republicans. In 2007, Congress agreed to rename the Great Hall of the Capitol Visitor Center Emancipation Hall in honor of the slaves who helped build it. As Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. argued, quote, "Emancipation is the great enduring theme of our nation's still unfolding story. Without emancipation, our house divided would not have stood. We would not be a beacon of freedom and democracy around the world. We would never have had, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, a new birth of freedom." End quote. Both the House and the Senate overwhelmingly approved the measure in November 2007, and President George W. Bush signed it into law the following January. 2 years later, on June 16, 2010, congressional leaders from both parties unveiled 2 plaques in Emancipation Hall that honored the work of enslaved African Americans in building the Capitol. The story of Emancipation Hall in many ways tells an inspiring and moving story of a nation's willingness to come to terms across party lines with its slave heritage. But it also raises some interesting and ultimately rather unsettling questions. Why would one name a building constructed by slaves Emancipation Hall as a way of honoring their legacy and history? They certainly were not emancipated when they worked there. Freedom undoubtedly represented the aspiration of those whose forced labor built the Capitol and so much of America, but it was definitely not their reality. It did not express the nature of their lives. Probably very few of them ever lived to see the end of slavery. How could naming the structure they built emancipation illustrate the nature of lives lived without freedom? If one really wanted to acknowledge them, why not call the building Slave Hall? Why would it be impossible to imagine an official government building in a country that claimed freedom as its greatest value with that name? Did the name Emancipation Hall, far from honoring the slaves who helped build it, instead represent yet another denial of their own history? If so, why did all of official Washington, including African American legislators like Jesse Jackson Jr., descended from slaves, rush to embrace it? So I wanted to start off with this passage, not just because of its timeliness, but it was incidents like this that really led me to think I needed to write this book. I needed to study this question more of the relationship of slavery and racism to American history and French history, and particularly to the idea of freedom in those histories. And I started out by thinking of this as a paradox. Many people have often pointed out that a country like the United States, or a country like France for that matter, both symbolizes freedom and also has had a major benefit in its history from slavery. So to take one example that's been often discussed, the 18th century saw the Enlightenment, the real flourishing of thinking about freedom and intellectual values around liberty. And it also saw the height of the transatlantic slave trade. But there are ways in which I don't really like contradictions or feel comfortable with them. I'm not really comfortable with the idea that two things can coexist without having some inner unity or interconnection beyond being a paradox. So I began to look for what that was, and I decided what that inner unity was, what brought these ideas of freedom and race together, was the idea of whiteness or white privilege. In other words, you could have freedom as long as it's only limited to white people, as long as it's only seen as a part of being white. Or to put it another way, in a simple sentence, to be free is to be white is to be free. So that formed the essential thesis of the book. I decided that I wanted to look at ways in which the idea of freedom was connected with racial distinction and racial discrimination, and explore that in the history of two nations. Now, why France and why the United States? I'm a French historian by training, and I'm American by birth and upbringing. So those two countries came naturally to me. But it also seemed more importantly that these were two countries for whom their very national identities centered around the idea of their inhabitants, their citizens being free. For the French, the revolutionary watchwords of liberty, equality, and fraternity have long defined the nation ever since the French Revolution. And even going back to the initial settlement of Gaul by the Franks, Frank meant freedom or free in their language. And of course, in America, the fact that this is a country that was built by immigrants and then created by a revolution for freedom against an imperial nation, Britain, has often emphasized the idea that to be American is to be free is to be above all American. And this has shaped not just the national lives of these two countries, but their foreign policies as well. So much of their foreign policies, including imperial policies, have really centered around the idea of imposing or exporting freedom worldwide, of making peoples of the entire world cherish freedom in the same ways that they do. So I realized when I came up with this idea and began investigating that probably a lot of people would find it controversial. And there are two objections that really came to mind immediately in approaching this topic. First of all, I think was the objection that how could you call something as important, as enlightened, as so dedicated to improving the lot of the human condition in general as freedom, how could you call that racist? How could you assign a negative value to the idea of freedom, which is one of the most important positive qualities that humanity has ever come up with? And I answered that in two ways, and I answered it in the book in a couple of ways. First of all, I'm not saying that all freedom is racist or even racially determined. There are many different kinds of freedom. Some have to do with race, some have to do with other human qualities. But I was interested in exploring one particular kind of freedom, the freedom that arose out of, in effect, white privilege. And the other objection, the other way I wanted to respond to that is to say that, well, we are so used to thinking of freedom as a wonderful positive value that we don't stop to think at times of how it can also be negative. And yet, if you just look at synonyms for freedom in the English language, some of those come to fore, like the idea of license or libertine, or anarchist, for example, people whose freedom is negative because it knows no boundaries, because it ultimately sort of destroys the freedom of other people. The self-destructive nature of the libertine, for example, is one case where freedom is ultimately a bad thing. Just as in other ways, in many ways, race has often been seen as a positive quality of human beings. The other objection I wanted to think about, and which rang very true to me, was the objection of how can you call something racist that has inspired so many people of color to sacrifice everything for it? If you look at histories of the civil rights movement, the history of African Americans in general, so often the word freedom figures prominently in the titles. So this is something of value that, precisely because it has been denied to many peoples of color in America and other parts of the world, has been seized upon as absolutely fundamental. All you have to do is look at the history of the civil rights movement, for example, and look at things like Freedom Summer, freedom rides, so on and so forth, to realize how important freedom is. And my answer to that is simply that, again, I understand that white freedom also inspired other movements for freedom against the strictures imposed by race. And it's important to honor those movements as well. So in looking at white freedom, I decided, okay, I needed to define it a bit more. My ultimate definition, of course, is the one that's encapsulated in the single sentence: to be white is to be free, and to be free is to be white. And what I mean by that is that if you look at, in many parts of American and French history, the idea of freedom has often been racially codified, racially shaped. That white privilege has been a crucial part of freedom as it has been understood by many peoples in these countries and in others. So, and at the same time, to be white, one of the key aspects of being white is to be free. If you are not free, there's a sense in which you are not really white. You do not really enjoy white privilege or white status in France and the United States historically. So you have to have freedom in order to be truly white. But at the same time, if you are a person of color, you cannot be truly free. That is what is implied by that, yeah, by that ideal and by the practices that result from that ideal. So that forms the basic sort of thesis of the book. And I use about 200 years of human history in France and America to explore the validity of that thesis. And I do so in a couple different ways. The first two chapters sort of stand out. The chapters 3 through 6 are basically chronologically organized, going from the Enlightenment, chapter 3, all the way to the post-World War II era, down to the present, or at least down to the collapse of the Soviet Union in chapter 6. The first two chapters are a bit different. In chapter 1, I look at what I like to call savage freedom. And this sort of takes up on the argument that I was making a few minutes ago, saying that not all kinds of freedom are necessarily valued or seen as valuable. And moreover, it extends that argument to say that in order to craft real freedom, or as it becomes white freedom, you have to suppress certain other aspects of what has often been seen as freedom or liberty. And I focus on two groups for whom their ideas of freedom in many ways form a danger to the norm of white freedom and have to be suppressed or at least transformed. And those two groups are pirates and children. So, for example, one of my favorite readings in this is, of course, Peter Pan, which unites those two stories. But I look at pirates as, in many ways, a symbol of freedom that had to be suppressed. Pirates were a danger to property, for example. They were represented a danger to the state. You could not have true freedom, white freedom, in a world that was run by pirates, or a world where pirates were permitted to run amok. I tend to focus on two areas of, well, actually 3 areas of piracy. One is the classic Pirates of the Caribbean in the early modern period. And the other is the piracy in North Africa and the Mediterranean coast, the so-called Barbary pirates, roughly the same time. And then I also look at a third kind of piracy in a very different vein, and that is internet piracy. The piracy that has come about since the end of the 20th century, and really highlights uses of the internet, things like Napster, for example, most classically, and other file sharing programs, to evade rules of the nation state and of corporations, create an own independent freedom sphere in the internet online. And how those all have to be in one way or another tamed or suppressed. Then with childhood, on the other hand, childhood is one of those periods of life that is transformed radically in the modern period. The classic study of childhood, historical study of childhood, is Philip Aries's A Century of Childhood. And Arias makes the point that up until the modern period, children were basically seen as little adults. They were not seen as needing special rules. With the Romantic era, then you have this new vision of childhood as an age of innocence, and an age where people need to be protected and also, of course, regulated or controlled or dominated and channeled into certain types of behavior that were morally acceptable. Only when one was mature could one have true freedom. And in fact, what John Stuart Mill at one point said, freedom is reserved to the mature races. He was speaking both of peoples of color and also, of course, of children. So this, of course, has caused its own sort of series of revolts. The idea of tempestuous adolescence, for example, the idea of Bohemian revolt throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But the idea of freedom ultimately emphasized that children had to grow up. They had to grow up into accepting their responsibilities as members of a mature society governed on legal lines and respecting property. That's what happens in the story Peter Pan. In Peter Pan, the lost boys, who were a group of children that were living in Never Never Land, are forced to come back to the real world of middle-class 19th century England and grow up and become, as the book says, mature men with jobs and beards. So freedom can only go so far. Savage freedom has to be repressed, and the idea of savage freedom has a strong racial component. So that's one chapter. The chapter 2, I really look at what is the most important icon of freedom in the modern world, the Statue of Liberty. And I explore the racial history of that statue. Americans are so used to associating the Statue of Liberty with the history of immigration as the icon that immigrants first saw when they came to America around the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries, that it is often neglected the fact that the Statue of Liberty was first designed by the French to commemorate the abolition of slavery in the United States after the Civil War. It was designed as a present to a country that was now entirely free and could celebrate that freedom. So the suppression of that meaning was one aspect of this whole history. It's also interesting that the idea of immigration, of the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of immigration, took a while to come. In many ways, in the late 19th century, after the statue was built, and when the first massive waves of European immigration began arriving from Eastern and Southern Europe, the statue was seen as an anti-immigrant symbol. There are literally illustrations of statues shrinking away in horror from filthy immigrants, or in one case, the Statue of Liberty being threatened by an anarchist with a bomb. It's only until you get to the 20th century, the second generation of immigrants settled speaking English fluently, that the statue then begins to symbolize their fate. And in effect, it only begins to relate to them since they have achieved whiteness status. So the Statue of Liberty for immigrants welcomed them, promising both freedom and whiteness at the same time, and promising the combination of the two. And I just wanted to end up by saying that the fact that the Statue of Liberty is America's greatest symbol of freedom is an interesting one, because it is located in New York Harbor and has a relationship to European immigrants. No one has proposed building a Statue of Liberty, for example, on Angel Island in San Francisco to commemorate Asian immigration, or on the US-Mexico border to commemorate Latinx immigration. And certainly nobody has proposed building a Statue of Liberty in Charleston, South Carolina, for example, to consider those who arrived from the Middle Passage. The fact that it is located in New York Harbor has also been used to obscure the fact that New York was one of America's great slave ports. And so you have a statue commemorating immigration from Europe, but you do not have a statue or any kind of monument commemorating those who arrived in New York Harbor as a result of the Middle Passage. So those are the first two chapters of the book. And then the rest of the book really looks at this whole idea of white freedom from the late 18th century, from the Enlightenment days down to the present. And what I argue is that over time, white freedom develops in many different ways in both the United States and France. I look at, for example, the American Revolution and how it was a revolution for liberty and for slavery at the same time. How, for example, during the Civil War, the people that fought most loudly in terms of keeping their liberties were not the people of the North, but the people of the South, who saw their cause as fighting for their freedom to own slaves. And then, you have at the same time, by the middle of the 20th century, a huge reaction against the idea of white freedom, embodied in movements like the struggles for decolonization and national independence in Africa and Asia, and the civil rights movement in the United States. In many ways, these movements triumphed. So 1965, in many respects, represents the high water mark of the struggle for a universal sense of freedom and a rejection of white freedom. But then, of course, there have been movements since then. The defeat of school integration, for example, in America, the decline of democracy in the new independent nations of the Third World, that have emphasized the restoration of white freedom. So it is a story that has a long history to it. It is a story that has had its triumphs and also its setbacks, but it is a story that continues to this day. And I wanted to end up by just talking just a bit about the last two events very recently that have come up that really speak to the story I'm trying to tell. One, of course, was the January 6, 2021 invasion of the Capitol building. This is an invasion that was carried on by an overwhelmingly white group of people, in fact, including many white supremacist groups who would organize their followers to join it, and in effect demanding the overthrow of the democratic government, which is seen as increasingly and overly multiracial and multicultural. It was a movement in many ways for white power. You can, of course, make the connection with the fact that slave labor helped build the Capitol building in the first place, to say that, in effect, there's a kind of renewal of the whiteness of the Capitol building, or the white power of the Capitol building. It was also interesting if you looked at or listened to what the people who invaded the building had to say for themselves. They often spoke in terms of languages of freedom. They often said they were there to restore their rights, to guard their freedoms, especially the freedom for their votes to count. One of the many ironies that surrounded that day was that you had people who were saying that people's votes should count, and yet they were doing so at the behest of the Republican Party that had been engaged in massive voter suppression directed against communities of color for years. So when they said votes should count, they really meant white votes should count, or that white freedom should be the freedom they fought for. The other thing I wanted to mention very briefly, and then I will open up the floor for questions, is a report that was recently released, in fact, just Monday. It was released by the President's Commission on Civil Rights. It was called the 1776 Report. And it had a very brief life. It is now, since President Biden took office today, it has been removed from the White House website. So I'm not sure what is going to happen to this report. But this is a report written in response to the New York Times' 1619 project of a couple of years ago that rejected any idea of any crimes committed by the American nation. Its debate about slavery in particular was fascinating because it argued that America had to be a slave nation to be born, and therefore that was justified. So what this speaks to is not just the idiosyncrasies of the Trump administration, but the fact that these ideas are still in broad circulation, that in many ways, America is still a country where freedom and whiteness have gone together and continue to go together. And it is something that is worth exploring. Now, at the same time, let me end up on a positive note, because I think that these are ideas that would have been uncontested a century ago, or even maybe 50 years ago. And the fact that they are now being contested and challenged very effectively speaks to the progress that America has made, and the hope that white freedom will become, hopefully one day soon, something that is only of interest to historians. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I'm more than happy to take any questions or comments you have on your minds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a couple questions and a comment. Mary Dill has noted that Biden dissolved the 1776 group, just as a comment in response to your comment there. And then we have a few questions here. The first one is, what thoughts do you have about this issue in countries beyond the US and France?
Okay, thank you for that question. I've explained the reasons why I chose France and the United States, but it was impossible really just to limit myself to those two countries. So two other countries that whose history surfaced big time in this book were Imperial Britain on the one hand and Nazi Germany on the other. And let me speak to the British case first. Britain is also an example of country. I mean, one of the things that interested me in this whole history, and involves Britain and France, was the fact that you could have a situation in the late 19th century of the unprecedented expansion of European empire, but more particularly the fact that expansion was led by two of the most democratic countries in Europe, Britain and France. The French case is particularly interesting because France, the French Third Republic, overthrew an empire in 1870 and established itself as a republican government, and also created the largest empire that the nation had ever known, the second largest the world had ever known. But the same is true of Britain. Britain also established a huge empire while at the same time it was expanding the franchise for working men and ultimately women at home. So this contradiction between democracy at home and colonialism and imperial exploitation abroad, it seemed to me had a real important racial component. And then, of course, there's the idea of Nazi Germany. Racism is very easy to look at in terms of Nazi Germany. What's more complicated is the idea of freedom being associated with Nazi Germany. And yet, if you look at the history of Nazi Germany, I read Mein Kampf from beginning to end, for example, you do find references to freedom, not of the individual, but of the race. And I think that's what makes Nazi Germany, or fascism in general, really distinctive. So freedom is not an individual prerogative, but it is a racial prerogative. And freedom and the exploitation of other races, i.e. subordinate races, or ultimately extermination of subordinate races really goes together. So the extreme of Nazi racism is a function of its desire, of its intention to create freedom for its own people defined as the people as a whole.
Thank you for that. The next question is, when looking at piracy, did you address female pirates such as Rachel Wall in relationship to the idea of freedom?
I did. And in fact, two of the illustrations I use are, one is Eugène Delacroix's Liberally Leading the People, which is a classic sort of image of an insurgent woman. But it was based, or at least had a strong relationship to drawing a century earlier of a female pirate, Anne Bonny, who is shown in very similar kind of situation. So this brings up the issue of gender in general in the history of white freedom. But let me just respond in terms of pirates. There were not very many celebrated female pirates, but there were a few. And for them, of course, piracy represented freedom in many different kinds of ways, not just the freedom of property, but freedom of sexual freedom from being oppressed by male society. And that society is growing increasingly oppressive as the time goes on. It's interesting to look at the timing of all this, because the classic age of piracy in the Caribbean comes to an end right around the 1720s. After that, and that's, by the way, when the romanticization of piracy really first starts. But the high point of sort of female oppression comes a little bit later with the rise of Victorian society. The 18th century is not as oppressive of women as the 19th century is, for example, at least in places like France and Britain. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, but nonetheless, still, I think the question is comment is very well taken, that piracy did represent a kind of outlet for slaves. There's a whole historiography that led by people like Marcus Rediker that talks about slavery as a kind, talks about piracy as a kind of empowerment for many different kinds of people. Slaves could take refuge on pirate ships, for example. And in a few cases, women could become self-standing individuals. Now, they usually have to masquerade as men, but still, it did offer an outlet for women that society in general did not.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody that if you would like to submit a question, you can do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we have a couple more here so far. Katie Boyle says, Professor Stovall, thanks so much for this great talk and looking forward to reading your new book. Listening to your talk, I'm reminded of Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, in which she argues that Blackness is narratively used to fill or juxtapose the empty frame that whiteness occupies in American literature. How might your argument complement or complicate this notion, particularly in comparing US and French empires?
Okay, well, that's a great question. And I'm not going to compete with Toni Morrison, let me just say that. But I think my argument does complement it. It says that, Blackness is in effect, one of the ways to look at Blackness is the absence of freedom, the absence of something that whites enjoy or are supposed to enjoy. Now, there's another side to it, which I really try to address in my first chapter, which is that the idea of savage freedom, that Blacks also kind of enjoy a certain kind of liberty that is not allowed to whites and whites in middle class society. This is part of where I'm going with the piracy argument, for example. It's why pirates become so romanticized, down to like birthday cakes featuring pirates emblems, for example, because piracy does symbolize a kind of freedom that's been lost, that has been denied to white freedom. And I think the same is true with Black culture. And you see it, with the writings of people like Norman Mailer in the 1950s and 1960s. So, but the point I would like to make about white freedom is that ultimately it sees this kind of freedom as much as superior to the kind of savage freedom embodied in Black culture and in other kinds of cultures. Something that is, those are seen as not only inferior, but ultimately needing to be suppressed. And yet, of course, they always have a role in established societies that continues down to the present day. That's why we do have pirate birthday cakes, for example. That's why we have many different aspects of Black culture that are championed, going down to hip hop culture, even though at the same time they were seen as ultimately a danger and inadmissible to the dominant society.
Thank you for that. An anonymous attendee says, excellent talk. Do Americans need to rethink their usage of the word freedom in an effort to create a more equal and equitable society? Should we be using different phrases or words? Do you have some ideas of the best way to honestly speak to our past and be hopeful for our future?
Okay, thank you for that question. And it's something I've thought a lot about, because I remember somebody else asking me, should we think of a different term for freedom? And I can see the answer, the argument for that, but I think my hesitation is just that, and this is something I opened up my talk with, so many people of color, so many different types of people have fought for a universal notion of freedom, have really defined their struggles and given their lives for this idea of universal freedom, that I hesitate to take that, in effect, to take that away from their memories and their legacies, right? So I think in many ways it's more a question of reclaiming the idea of freedom from white freedom. And I think one of the things that makes me think positively about our current situation is that more and more people really want to do that. They really want to come to grips with an idea of freedom that is truly inclusive and to structure it that way. I mean, the most surprising thing and the most striking thing about the Black Lives Matter movement of last spring and summer was the fact that so many whites belonged to it. So many whites embraced it. Whites from all over the country, from many different kinds of backgrounds, embraced it. And I think, however that movement came out in the short term, that is a very, very encouraging development. And it points to the idea that, as I tried to end my talk, the idea of white freedom has become increasingly sort of unacceptable. Partly you could see this in the 1960s, that at a period when it became all of a sudden unacceptable to use racist language. That represented a real change, and I think we've continued to see those kinds of changes. So whereas I understand the idea for having perhaps a new word, and maybe it does make sense to do that, but I'm also really attached to, as a historian, I guess, as somebody who loves the past, to the idea of honoring those people that fought for freedom by honoring their own legacies. Let me make another point, which is somewhat similar to this, I hope, which is I talked about the Statue of Liberty and New York's role as a slave port. One of the interesting things that we've lived through in the last few years is the idea of attacks on Confederate memorials, taking down statues of Confederate veterans, statues honoring those who fought for the Confederacy. I think that's all well and good, but I think it would also be good to have a positive approach, would be to erect statues to people that fought for a more universal idea of freedom or fought against racist oppression. So, for example, in New York Harbor, I would love to see, I don't want to see anybody take down the Statue of Liberty, but I would love to see another statue that commemorated the victims of the slave trade who came to New York. There's a wonderful image showing a rebel slave being literally burnt alive in New York City in 1741. How about that? In fact, it has in some ways a sort of uncanny similarity to images of the Statue of Liberty. How about that as another kind of Statue of Liberty? An image that really emphasizes a universal vision of freedom. And how about starting to create statues like that or monuments like that that really emphasize our commitment to universal freedom throughout the country?
Okay, it looks like we have one more question. Another anonymous attendee says, thank you for this fascinating talk. I'm curious what you found were the most fundamental differences between the US and France with regard to freedom and/or race.
Okay, thank you for that question. There was a lot of similarity. There was also a lot of difference. I think that the major difference was there was not in France a population in metropolitan France, in European France, and not a population equivalent to African Americans or Latinos or Chicanos. There's not that kind of population of color until very recently. It does exist. I mean, part of my own research has been to show that these populations do exist, but they did not have anywhere near the size or the cultural impact that African Americans and the Latinx and Asian American populations have had in the United States. And I think that has made a real difference. One of the real differences between France and the United States today is that in France, it is very hard to use the term race. France values itself as a colorblind society. And so it is very hard to actually even address the term. I can remember once reading an interview with an American reporter who was assigned to a division of the Paris police during the riots of 2005, which were a major suburban uprising. And at one point, he asked the police captain, why were there no policemen of color in this detachment? And the captain's response was, this is France. We don't talk in those terms. We are all citizens of the Republic. We do not recognize racial differences. And that was a sort of classic response, which, probably would not have happened in the United States. So I think that to answer the question, the major differences have been a more sort of intense focus on this contradiction between racism and freedom in the United States and France, even though I would argue they exist in both countries.
Great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have. Thank you so much, Tyler, for joining us tonight.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for all your questions and for taking the time, and thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you for sharing your work with us. Thank you to the audience for spending your evening with us. Again, you can learn more about this book and purchase White Freedom at the link that I've posted in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and please be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.